אני גאה ונרגשת להזמין את סנטור ג'ו ליברמן לשיחה בארבע עיניים עם העיתונאית ולהב הרקוב, פרשנית בחירה, כתבת מדינית בג'רוזלם פוסט. בבקשה.
So, very briefly, when I was in the U.S. Senate, we would start remarks by saying, if I may have a point of personal privilege. In other words, before Lahab starts to ask me questions, I want to really thank everyone who's here tonight. My wife and I are really honored by your presence, and it's really quite an impressive group. And it only happened because of one person, who was Ruth Cabeza Abramson, who had the drive, the vision. Let me start it the other way. She had the vision, and then she had the drive and persistence to bring this group together. Leaders matter, and she is led. And if I may add to that, while I'm speaking about women who lead, well, of course, my wife is one, but I used to say when I was in the Senate, I may be the senator, but it's my wife who's the commander-in-chief. This I knew. But I also want to really pay tribute to Irina Nevzlin. I am honored to be the chairman of the board, the international board, the honorary chairman. This is a great thing that happens when you leave office. You get positions that allow you to say what you support, and you don't have to do any work. And this is a great thing. Anyway, I'm proud to be here tonight for this conference, and having given that brief statement of personal privilege. It's a pleasure to meet you.
You too. Growing up in the U.S., you were certainly a figure that I think plenty of Jewish people in the U.S. looked to and admired your sort of not only your political position and skill, but that you were someone who was such clearly a Jewish person on the national political stage and a proud Jew. And I wanted to ask you about the thing that certainly I think among American Jews that you were so famous for, that you were really made sure to keep Shabbat while you were in the Senate. You would walk to the Hill when you needed to. And I wanted to ask you sort of what was the biggest challenge in keeping Shabbat while being a senator?
So, I was unusual in American politics, maybe in many ways, but the way that I want to talk about is that I was the first member of the U.S. Senate to be Shomer Shabbat, and then, of course, the first Jewish American to be privileged to be nominated for a national party office, the vice president with Al Gore. So my observance of Shabbat became of public interest. And the first thing I want to say is that in the end, I actually think, in a strange way, it helped me politically. And I'll tell a specific story about it tomorrow. But I found that even though some Jews were ambivalent that there was somebody who was observing Shabbat who was so public, the Christians tended generally to be quite respectful and excited about it. And I think a lot of them supported me, certainly in Connecticut, for that reason. So the hardest thing, but I made a decision early on when I came back to Shabbat observance as a young man. I left it for a while, and I tell that story in this book. I made a decision that I would not be involved in anything political on Shabbat. But I felt that I had a responsibility, and I was basing this on conversations with my rabbis, looking at precedent, that I had a responsibility, for tzorchei tzibor, for the welfare of the community, both the general community and, in a way, the Jewish community. And if I did not carry out that responsibility, I would, in some sense, be diminishing respect that people had for Judaism, and perhaps making it harder for somebody else who was Shomer Shabbat to run. as a state senator or as attorney general, which I was before I became a U.S. senator, there was rarely a conflict between Shabbat and my public service because all the non-Jews that I was in the state senate with wanted to get home on Friday afternoon too, not to observe Shabbat. They just wanted to get home. But in the U.S. Senate, probably on 40 or 45 occasions in the 24 years I was there were votes on Friday night or Saturday, and I really felt very strongly that I had to be there. Because if I was not, the people of Connecticut would only have half the representation they were entitled to. So probably those were the hardest moments. I mean, kashrut is more personal, et cetera, but trying to, I mean, being away from my family if that was necessary. Thank God this was when my knees, before I had knee replacement surgery, I would walk the 4.5, if we had a session on Friday night, I would walk, and nothing on Saturday, I would walk the 4.5 miles home, usually with a police escort from the Capitol Police. I didn't ask for it, and in fact, I didn't want it, but the sergeant at arms who was in charge of the Capitol Police said to me, Senator, if something happens to you when you're walking home on your Sabbath while I'm in charge of your security, it's going to be very bad for my career. So you're taking security. Anyway, that was probably the hardest and the most direct conflict. And it turned out that some of the biggest things that I was involved in, the vote on the Iraq War of 1991, the final vote on repeal of the discriminatory don't ask, don't tell policy of the Pentagon, and probably many others, happened on Shabbat. But I knew I had to be there, and I'm glad I was, and took a little extra effort, but it worked out.
So we're already talking about votes in Congress and
Yes.
politics. Take a little detour from Shabbat to ask you a couple of political questions I think people are interested in.
Okay.
I know you're very involved in opposing a nuclear Iran and calling for a sort of tougher stance from the U.S. And I'd like to hear what you think about how the Biden administration is dealing with the Iran issue, as Iran's nuclear program has been advancing in recent months, and they're still sort of waiting to see if Iran wants to negotiate.
Yeah, well, I'm very troubled with the Biden administration policy on Iran. You know, I remain a Democrat. I supported Joe Biden. I know him forever. We served together for 24 years. I have a lot of admiration for him. But just as I strongly oppose the original Iran nuclear agreement, which I thought gave away all of the leverage we in Congress and both parties built with the economic sanctions we put on Iran, and we didn't get hardly anything in return for it from Iran. Today it's even worse. Today the leadership of Iran, the supreme leader and the new President Raisi, are really extremists, anti-American, obviously anti-Israel, violent supporters of terrorism. I don't know how any American administration could think that you could make a deal with them about anything as important as nuclear weapons and think that they would keep the deal or give very much. But there's something going on in this administration where they just, maybe to turn around, frankly, what Trump did. You know, sometimes that happens. I saw it happen in various administrations of both parties. The one that comes in wants to do something different than the one that just left. But I think Iran still desperately needs to get out of the economic sanctions we have imposed on them. And we must ask for the kinds of changes in Iranian policy, including the end of their nuclear program, that they will never give in a way that we can trust. So I hope that that the Biden administration will develop a plan B, because I think their plan A to renegotiate back into the Iran nuclear agreement will fail. And I hope the plan B will be a statement, an issuance of what is called a credible threat against Iran if they break out toward actual nuclear capability. And the credible threat really should include more aggressive military action by the United States and more fulsome support with weapons and armaments for Israel and our allies in the Arab world who would want to take action against Iran. So I think this is really, of all the challenges in the world, rising China, Putin causing problems, North Korea with a strange and rogue administration, the most serious threat to world security today, and I'm speaking as an American security, certainly to Israeli security and Gulf Arab security, is Iran. And we have to take them that seriously.
So you mentioned sort of increasing support for Israel and America's Arab allies to arm themselves, and we're sort of right in the middle of this debate going on in the Senate about funding Iron Dome. It's a debate that's kind of like 48-2, and it passed 420-9 in the House. But you see, the Senate's a little bit of a different story, but in the House that it was these sort of young, progressive Democrats who were holding it up. And that while their power is small, they seem to have a growing influence. How do you think Israel can counter that trend and continue to enjoy strong bipartisan support?
Yeah, okay. Thank you. Oh, look at that. This, of all people, is my daughter. And she brought her Abba a drink of water.
It's a different mitzvah.
Thank you, sweetheart. So let me deal with the vote on Iron Dome first very briefly. So I've often felt and said that in one sense, politics is like sports, because it boils down to numbers. You know, you have a score at the end of a game. In baseball, you have a batting average, whatever. In politics, you have numbers at the end of an election, and in Congress, you have numbers and votes. And in the midst of reason to worry about some of those developments on the left of the Democratic Party, the vote on Iron Dome really tells us where members of both parties in Congress are. I mean, the so-called squad, which has said things that are more anti-Israel than I ever heard in my 24 years in the Senate. When it came down to it, they overplayed their hand, and the vote, they could only get 9 votes, as you said, out of 435 members of Congress to stop the funding for Iron Dome. So that should tell us that right now, thank God, there continues to be strong bipartisan support in Congress for a strong U.S.-Israeli relationship. But the voices of these 9 are more stridently opposed to Israel than ever before in Congress. And I fear that they represent a rising group within the Democratic Party and perhaps among younger people in the country. And I think, what should the Israeli government do? I think the Israeli government, all of us who care about the U.S.-Israel relationship in the United States, should respond to everything this small group of left-wing Democrats says, but the Israeli government should try to get them to come over here. And anytime any leader of the Israeli government or a member of the Knesset is in Washington, they should ask to sit down with Ocasio-Cortez and the others, because they are acting on false premises. And, you know, they're taking what I would describe in simple terms as a classic European left-wing socialist view of the world. And it's wrong. I mean, to call Israel a colonial power, Israel is an anti-colonial power. Israel was founded as part of the wave of national self-liberation movements in the late 40s after the Second World War. To say that Israel is, God forbid, a racist country, I say to people in the U.S., by American definition, more than half the people of Israel would be called people of color. So give me a break, I guess is what I'm saying. And we have to confront this, because if we don't and Israel doesn't, it will spread. So I hope that's what happens.
So I've been told we're running out of time, but
Yeah.
we haven't even mentioned your book yet. So I want to give you a chance to just tell us briefly what inspired you to write a book about Shabbat.
Yeah, I mean, it was, in a way, it was fate that I turned out, as I said earlier, to be the first elected official who observed Shabbat. And a lot of people ask me questions about it. What do you do? And of course, the most a frequent question was, how can you possibly be a U.S. Senator and observe your Sabbath? And my answer, sort of paraphrasing Achad Ha'am, was, I don't know how I could be a U.S. Senator and not observe Shabbat. And because of the way it centers me, it gives me a time away from everything else. So I wrote the book in part to answer those questions people had, because I thought I had been put by fate, by Hashgacha Pratit, whatever, in this position, and I had a responsibility to answer the questions. But I must say that I also had another feeling, which was that I love Shabbat. It just is the foundation point of my life, my family, all the rest. And I do feel, to pick up the term that has been used earlier, that Shabbat is a gift that, as it says in the Talmud, that Hashem gave Moshe to give to the rest of us. And I wanted to try, in my own non-rabbinical way, to do a little kiruv work and see if I could encourage more people to begin to observe some parts of Shabbat. So that's why I wrote the book, and it got a wonderful response in the U.S. from Jews and non-Jews. I actually ended up feeling that, I've been blessed to have the opportunity to do a lot of important things in my life, but I ended up enacting legislation, et cetera, et cetera. But I ended up feeling, and I feel it today, that writing this little book about Shabbat may be one of the most significant things. It is one of the most significant things to me that I did in my life. So, that was 2013 when the book appeared. Last year, as they say, out of the blue, Min HaShamayim, Ruth calls me and says, Shabbat Unplugged wants to publish your book in Hebrew. Wow, so this now gives me a chance to bring my goal of a little kiruv to Eretz Yisrael. Wow. So I was very excited about it. And then, frankly, I didn't know anything about Shabbat Unplugged or She'arim or Ruth. And I've learned in the last 2 or 3 weeks that when this lady has a goal, she's going to realize it. And I'm very proud to be part of this. And I really believe that just as somebody said, maybe it was Ruth, that when you look back in the period after the destruction of the Second Temple, from exile in Babylon, Ezra and Nehemiah decided that without sustaining the religious identity of the Jewish people, without the Beit Mikdash, there would be no Jewish nation. So they required the public reading of the Torah. They started the whole halachic process. And, I think it can honestly be said that two institutions they created, the synagogue, the Beit Knesset, the Shul, and Shabbat, really sustained the Jewish people through almost 2,000 years of exile until we were able, through the courage of so many here, to reestablish the state as a sovereign nation in this land. And I think it's a very exciting and inspiring idea, since Shabbat played such a critical role in keeping Am Yisrael alive for all those years, that now that the land is here, the nation is here, that we try to use Shabbat to unite the Jewish people here in Israel and hopefully outside. So that's why I wrote the book. That's why I'm so thrilled it's being published in Hebrew. And none of us, including Ruth, as confident as she is, think this is going to happen overnight. But it's a journey worth making with a destination that is remarkably attractive. So that's why I'm so glad to be here tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Lieberman.